Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Cyrus Janssen, an international business consultant and analyst on China who lived for 10 years in China and also speaks Chinese fluently and who does really excellent work. So, I can't recommend it enough, and I will leave the details to his own channel in the description. So,
Fantastic.
Cyrus, it's good to see you again.
Good, good to see you as well, Glenn. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Well, I've been following your work a lot lately, and find your insights on China to be absolutely fascinating. And well, I do have many questions for you
Sure.
because one of the key things is as China grows stronger and becomes more and more powerful, the tendency appears here in the West to become more hostile towards China, which also, although I guess, manifests itself in the construction of these very unfavorable narratives about China. And a key concern is often that we might end up deluding ourselves that we're painting a picture of China which doesn't
Right.
actually exist. But from your experience, again, an American who lived there for so long and again speak the language, what are some of the main misconceptions and what do people misunderstand about China and its economic rise as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Glenn. So I think the first thing I always want people to understand is that I think even today in 2025, people's perception of China is still stuck somewhere 30, 40, even 50 years ago. A lot of people in the West still look at China as a very poor country, very underdeveloped, and unfortunately, this image of people wearing Chairman Mao suits and people riding bicycles is still very much alive. This was interesting. This was alive in 2007, the first year that I went to China, but yet, 20 years later, it's still, very present where people think, wow, this is like a third world country. It's a developing country. It's so poor. And I think when you actually start seeing these videos from China, you start seeing what we've seen in the last 12 months, especially now that China has opened its borders again after COVID, and that there's been a very huge surge of international tourism to China. A lot of people are realizing, wow, this is very different than what we've heard about, what we've seen, what we read about. And there's just the perception of what China is in Western culture is very different from the reality, and that media has had a big part in that. So my message to everybody is always stay curious. There's never been a better time to visit China than right now, and if you do, you will be experiencing a country that is very different from everything you've heard. So go there with an open mind, experiencing it, and you're probably going to have a great time.
I was there in Beijing around New Year's, and I felt they looked at me when I had a credit card as if I showed up with a checkbook or something. They all used
Exactly.
the QR codes. Uh,
Yes.
but how has the economy changed over the years?
Well, I think what's really interesting is I'll take you back to 2007 when I first arrived in China, and that was really a pivotal year. So China's GDP grew by 14% that year alone, which is an astronomical number. I mean, it's very, very big. And of course, 2008 was a very big year for China. This was when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics, and I think that was really China's coming out party. That was China's opportunity to really present itself on the world stage and say, "Look, we are here. We have arrived, and it is, the 21st century will be Asia century. We're going to have a very large role in that." And of course, over the years, we've seen China's economy continue to grow, industries, seemingly come out of nowhere. A great example of this would be the EV industry. 2007, there was no Chinese EVs in play. At that time, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, American companies like Ford, GM, Buick, these companies dominated auto sales in China. And I remember very distinctly that at that time, it was seen as a prestige for Chinese people to buy these foreign brands. And they would save up money. They typically don't finance things in China. You typically pay in cash. So it's not uncommon to, come in with a large amount of cash, like a duffel bag full of cash, and be paying for a Buick van because the Buick is American and you wanted to be seen having that American car. And so that's very much what it was in 2007. And now, over the last 18 years or so, you've seen a lot of industries rise up. Where now China is really dominating these industries. So again, going back to the automobile industry, now on the road in China, over 50% of the cars are electric vehicles. The vast majority of them being Chinese brands. Tesla obviously is big in China. It still has a presence there, but there are dozens and dozens of very high-end elite EV brands, and they have, we've seen a complete 180 from the Chinese consumer, where again, 18 years ago, no one would want a Chinese car. Now everyone's saying, "Wow, the Chinese tech is so advanced. We want to have a piece of that, and we're very proud. Let's buy in China, made in China. We want to use Chinese brands." Another great example is Hisense, which is one of the fastest growing television brands. And so even in the United States, for example, they have a very large market share because they're developing incredible TVs at an amazing price point, and it's able to compete with the Sonys, the Panasonics, and certainly any American or European brand. So I think China's economy is always evolving. We hear a lot right now in Western media that China's economy is in tatters, that there's it's declining. It's still projected to grow 5%, which is still a very good percentage given the fact of how big it is, right? China's economy in 2025, much larger than it was in 2007 when it was able to grow by double-digit growth. Of course, fast forward 18 years, that economy has grown so much, double-digit growth is really, it's not feasible anymore. The economy is now too large. But I still think that there are still many opportunities when you look at fields like artificial intelligence. Again, China is very much leading in this field as well, and renewable energy. So, I would say that China's economy has evolved, and that's a healthy thing for the economy because China as a country has also evolved. It's not the same developing country it was when I first went there nearly 20 years ago.
Yeah, because we often still speak about China catching up and copying our technologies, well, ours, mainly American technologies.
Right.
But this, yeah, something very different we see now, and this is also the speed of things. As you mentioned, only a few years ago, I think Elon Musk he mocked the idea of China with yeah, electric cars, but now, of course, the electric vehicles coming out of China are so powerful that and so competitive that we have to, at least in Europe, try to stop it with tariffs. And again,
Right.
and I think this is a problem with the United States as well, that the ability to compete, yeah, appears to be slipping away. They're simply much more competitive. But how do you see? Because you mentioned the economy is maturing now, so they can't develop in the same path they did before. But a lot of the technologies are quite interesting because once they, developing this battery cars, self-driving cars, that's largely the same technologies you would use in robotics with the, sensor and all this. So you can already see the competitiveness branching out. But how do you see where the Chinese economy would go? Well, for I guess 5, 10 years. What are the main hurdles and
Yeah.
what are the main, I guess, opportunities as well?
Yeah, the great question. I do want to highlight one thing you mentioned real quick is that you said, for many years, Western companies or Western governments, mainly the United States, was very worried about Chinese stealing this American tech. We actually seen the complete opposite happening now. This is a fascinating story that was shared in the Financial Times where BYD, now the number one car brand in the world, overtaking Tesla, and in terms of how many cars they're producing every year. Well, BYD has just announced that they are going to put a pause on developing a plant in Mexico in fears that their tech secrets could be leaked to America. They don't want to be that close to the United States because they fear the United States wants to get access to their advanced tech. So again, Glenn, this is a very interesting thing where, again, 20 years ago, that headline would be, inconceivable. No one would imagine Americans wanting to steal Chinese tech. But now the tables have been turned where, yes, BYD and these Chinese EVs, they are leading the industry. There's no question about that. And I think that's really important to point out because, this is not a political statement. It's not me trying to say, oh, China's better or, this, Chinese government is amazing. It has really nothing to do with that. Let's just look at simple facts. And, if you talk to people within the auto industry, I think the best example that I can give you is Jim Farley, who's the CEO of Ford. He actually went to China and he picked up the Xiaomi SUV and he actually had it shipped in a cargo plane from Shanghai back to Detroit. And he personally is driving around the Xiaomi SUV in the streets of Detroit. And he said, I absolutely love this SUV. I don't want to give it up. I know it might look bad that I'm the Ford CEO, but this Chinese EV is incredible. And I think when you look at stories like that, that is astounding. I mean, that is just incredible that I mean, even from a PR perspective, right? Ideally, you don't want the CEO of one of America's most iconic car companies driving around a competitor brand, let alone a Chinese brand. But yet, that just shows you how advanced that technology is. And again, I don't need to, there's nothing political about that statement. It's just simply looking at tech and looking objectively at these automobiles. And wow, China's really producing some advanced tech. So now to go to your question, where does China go from here? What is going to happen? Well, this is what's interesting in China is that for many years, real estate became, a very large portion of the GDP growth. And, I have a little bit of personal experience in this because I did buy an apartment in Shanghai and I was able to flip that apartment for a very nice profit about 6 years later. So I bought that apartment, about a two-bedroom apartment in Shanghai in 2009. And that was a time I remember very distinctly where I had some clients of mine that I wanted to buy a piece of real estate, but I was very worried. I'm just like, well, how's the market going to go? Is this a risky investment? And they said, Cyrus, you're buying real estate in Shanghai. This is literally you will no chance at losing in this. It's only going one direction. It's only going to go up. And I, took faith in that because in 2009, the economy was still growing very, very fast. And Shanghai really being, the big power city, it did make a lot of sense, right? It's not really going to go down. And in fact, the house appreciated very rapidly. It had a lot of appreciation in just a short number of years. And I ultimately decided to move to Hong Kong. So I said, I think it's time to sell. A lot of people said, Cyrus, don't sell. It's going to go up forever. But I said, don't be greedy. You've made some money, like sell the apartment, be part of that. And so what happened with that, Glenn, is that a lot of people started speculating and a lot of people, obviously greed starts coming into factor. We saw this very, very prevalent in my home country of the United States around 2008, 2009. Let's not forget that global financial crisis was really a real estate catastrophe in the United States where, you could get 0% mortgages. You could buy a new house with no money down. I mean, how is that a good policy? That's absolutely crazy that you could buy a house with no money down, and you would have people buying three, four, five, six houses with this intention that this will always go up. This will always go up. This isn't risky. This is always going to go up. And of course, as we know, every real estate market in the world at some point is going to have a correction. And so that's what we're seeing in China. We're seeing the real estate market has come down, and the government has come out. They've said, look, we don't want people speculating. We don't want you buying three, four, five apartments, trying to flip them and keeping them empty. Your home should be a place where you live, and it should be your residency. And so we've seen this shift from the government as well, saying, look, we don't want you to speculate. We don't want you flipping real estate. We want you to be buying real estate to live in and, be more conservative in that regard. So there's been a shift in that. There's been a shift in the Chinese economy, specifically with real estate. We've had a couple of developers that really got in some financial trouble where the Chinese government had to step in and said, look, you're growing too fast. You have way too much debt. This is not sustainable. You're going to have to stop. And the Chinese government came in before it got a little bit too messy. And I think again, this is all problems that is happening when you have the most populated country in the world, the fastest growing economy in the world, and also we've seen a dramatic shift as well, Glenn, is that over the last 40 years, we've had hundreds of millions of people, basically go from the lower class into the middle class. So we've seen a large transfer of wealth. We've seen a large amount of industries being born. When I'm back in China, there's a few industries that I'm looking at right now. So obviously one is the EV industry, very big. We've already mentioned that. Anything to do with renewable energy, whether that's going to be wind turbines, solar energy, these are very big sectors where, even as recent as 2008 and 2009, the United States had a very large market of the solar panel production. There's a small town in Michigan in the United States that around 2008, they had around 30 to 40% of global manufacturing in solar panels. It was wild. And it's like, wow, really? Michigan was leading. And that has been reduced basically to zero now. China has like 98.9% of the market share of this manufacturing. Because why? Because they can do it for cheaper, they can do it in bigger quantities, and they can really advance that industry with better technology as well. And so, the other thing is really artificial intelligence. We've seen China develop this tremendously. I think what's really fascinating is the robotics industry. And I think that's something that you briefly touched on, but not a lot of people do talk about this, is the fact of how aggressive China is moving to develop these industries. And that is going to revolutionize a lot of the manufacturing and a lot of the production moving forward. And this is actually very important for China because China does have a population crisis. China's population, if according to forecasts, if forecasts remain true, China's population is going to decline a tremendous amount within the next 80 years. So by the time it's 2100, 75 years from now, China's population is forecasted to be around 800 million. So, I mean, it's going to lose almost 500 million people in population over the next 75 years. That's according to the forecast right now. So, China won't be the most populated country in the world. Actually, right now, it already isn't. India has overtaken China in that regards. But you're going to see China continue to decline a little bit because a lot of have a very elderly population and there simply won't be as many workers. So, what is China doing? They're getting ahead of that and they're having these robotics industry realizing that this is going to be very important. And we've actually already seen this, come out and play where we have these dark factories that are now in China. And a dark factory means there's no lights on because, it's basically all robotics. You don't need to power the lights on. Everything can just work in the dark because, they can go 24/7 because it's just all robotics. All of these cars being assembled by robotic arms and you need very few people to actually be there. We've seen even certain industries like the mining industry, where traditionally, obviously, a very dangerous job. Getting hundreds of people miles down in the ground, extracting coal and this thing. Very very difficult working conditions. Well, Huawei has come out and they have revolutionized the whole mining industry by making this digital. Now the modern day miners are sitting in air conditioned offices at the surface, using robotics, using advanced 5G and 6G networks to go down into the mines and do everything through robotics and 5G and all of these advanced industries. So that's where I see the future of China going is just everything with technology. And like you said, you try to use a credit card in Beijing, that's old school, right? No one uses a credit card. Everything's through your phone, everything's through WeChat Pay. China's a cashless society. You really go to China to see the future of where our world is going. And that's why I always enjoy going back to China because if I want to see what the world's going to look like in 5 to 10 years, I'll go to China because they're living it right now.
Yeah, they were very friendly. Though. I tried in a coffee shop to offer to use money, and they were so kind. They took the money and went to the neighboring store to see if they actually had cash, which could be changed, but they were
Nice.
not.
Yeah.
So, but you mentioned a global financial crisis, but this was an interesting time because this is when both the United States became more worried about its dependence on China, but also China became more worried about its reliance on the US in its growth model. And you saw afterwards the Chinese beginning then to push more for this technological development, a more aggressive industrial policies, the Belt and Road Initiative, launching all this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and again, going through a lot of this new developments in which I guess, outgrew the Western-led international economic system and began to take more of the levers of power. But then we saw under the first Trump administration the efforts to, I guess, hamper the growth of China. At least I think in the past we used to refer to human rights if we want to sanction, but now I think honesty is beginning to kick in. We just say
Right.
we can't really compete. How can we
Yeah.
slow down the Chinese? But how do you see the development of this? I guess you can call it an economic war or tech war. I'm thinking about the efforts to cancel the chips of export the chips to China. It was
Yeah.
meant to take down their main industries. I know the head of Google had reassured the Washington that this strategy would work.
Right.
It's obviously didn't, but how do you see this economic war going? Do they have the same? Do the Chinese have an ability to, I guess, reduce their dependence on the US, and how will it affect the United States?
Yeah. No, fantastic questions, Glenn. I really love this question because there's a lot of naive thinking from a lot of U.S. politicians and a lot of even businessmen. You mentioned Eric Schmidt, a former head of Google, who said, in my mind, we are 3 years ahead of China in AI, and that might as well be an eternity. We have this commanding lead. Essentially, we don't need to worry about China. They're never going to be able to catch up. You've probably heard the story of the tortoise and the hare. Where the rabbit and the turtle are racing, and the rabbit goes to the side of the road and says, "I'm so far ahead, I'm just going to take a nap on the side of the road, and I don't need to worry about this tortoise in the back." Well, what's interesting with that is China's not a tortoise, that's actually two rabbits racing each other. And so, what's amazing about this is that I find it very naive, and I find it just very silly for people to bet against China from innovating. Right? Again, you have a country where you have 10 times the amount of STEM graduates. So that's science, technology, engineering, and math. You have a country that is filled with engineers and mathematicians that literally, some of the smartest people in the world are from China. And I think what's really sad about this is, it really hurts the United States in many ways. Number one, over there, as the United States, my home country, we are an immigrant country, right? We welcome people from around the world into our borders. And what's incredible about China specifically, this is really fascinating, is that, for decades, China lost its most intelligent people to universities around the world, most specifically the United States, right? Just in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, early 2000s, all of the brightest minds from China would have left China, come to the United States, studied in the US, and said, wow, you know what? I want to be, I'm going to, have my career here in the United States. And unfortunately, with this China threat, and we had an initiative called the China Initiative, where the U.S. government purposely went out to all of the universities, and they would target the ethnicity, right? They would target, if you were a Chinese person, you would be a target, and we'd say, hey, are you colluding with the Chinese government? But what's sad is you have these researchers that had dedicated their entire careers to the United States, right? They were educated in the US, their children were born in the United States, they had their 30-year career in academia in America, and then all of a sudden, their careers were ruined by the U.S. government because of false allegations that they had potentially had connections back to China's government. In the couple of years that the China Initiative ran, they did not find one professor that had connections back to China's government, but yet they had ruined all of these professors' lives by just even the allegations alone. So what happened? Well, a lot of these professors said, you know what? I don't want to be in this environment anymore. I'm going to go back to China. And you can look on the South China Morning Post almost weekly. There's a top professor, whether it's mathematics or artificial intelligence or biotechnology, world-renowned researcher from Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, leaving America after 30 years, going back to China. So this is a really tough thing for America. I mean, this is not good for the United States in the long run. We now have a bill from Republican politicians who say that they want to ban all Chinese nationals from studying in the United States, which is just absolutely absurd. I don't think that would ever get passed, but even by putting forth that bill, saying this is an idea that I have, I think it's very, very, very toxic, in my opinion. But I think when we go back to the technology and in this race, for example, Donald Trump launched the trade war, and in many ways, I think was actually the best thing that ever happened to China. Because I'll give you a specific example when we look at the chip industry. Intel sold a tremendous amount of chips and hardware and software, or mainly hardware. They sold a tremendous amount of chips and hardware to China. And actually, at one point, Intel was deriving more revenue from China than they were the United States, which is an incredible piece of data. Now, all of a sudden, Intel, which has been around, it's a staple of the American stock market, right? It's been on the S&P 500 for many years. And so what's interesting is that all of a sudden, Trump and then Biden said, you know what, we don't want you selling any more to China. You're going to have to cut out that part of your revenue. Well, gosh, we derive more revenue from China than we do the United States. So if you want us to cut off that part of revenue, well, what do you think is going to happen to the company? Go take a look at what's happened to Intel stock over the last 18 months. It's by far the number 500. It's the worst performing stock in the S&P 500. It is down, I think, 60-70% last time I looked in the last 12 months or so. And I met with Intel employees who have just it's just so sad. Like, I've just dedicated my career to this company. We were so great. And the other thing that they missed is they never got on board with AI. They completely missed out. So now they're missed that boat. And so Intel's screwed. I mean, they have no way to go forward. And it's just really a shadow of an American company that it once was. And again, I think in one case, China would have been very happy to just be the number one customer, right? If everything would have continued as normal, China would have never developed these technologies because why would I need to invest? If you guys make great chips, I'll just buy them from you. I'll buy as many as you want. As many as you want to sell me, I'll just keep buying, buying, and buying. And we're going to take these chips and build our industries and do our thing. Oh, but now you're going to stop me from buying? Well, with the thought that I'm just going to what, roll over and die? I'm going to give up. Well, no. So if you're going to stop me from buying, you're kind of forcing me into a corner. There's only one thing that's left to do, and that's I'm going to start innovating. And that's exactly what you saw. And again, I just find it very naive for people to say, you know what, we're going to sanction China, we're going to cut off China, and that is going to limit them. They're basically done. But we know Chinese people, they're very, very innovative. There's a term in Chinese called 想办法. Xiang means to think, and 办法 means a solution. And you hear this a lot in Chinese culture where, when people are problem solving and it's just like, gosh, there's no way to think of this. It's like, 我们想办法. We got to think of a solution. It's always, that's the first go-to is always think of a solution. And so, you have a country full of innovators, a country full of problem solvers. So again, you cut us off from the technology, no problem. Let's go gather as many engineers as we need, and we're going to go figure out how to do that. And again, over the years, we've seen breakthrough after breakthrough, breakthrough after breakthrough. Now, is China at the same level of the United States? No. China is still trailing, but the gap is narrowing very, very quickly. And you're seeing a tremendous amount of growth. Again, Huawei, one of the biggest and most successful Chinese companies. There was a time when those sanctions really did hurt Huawei's business. It was a short-term pain. The Ren Zhangfei, who was the CEO and the founder, he said he made a memo to his employees. Look, we need to prepare for some very turbulent times ahead. It's not going to be easy. We're going to have to really dig deep, and we're going to have to work even harder to overcome. And what did they started to do? They started to diversify. Well, instead of this being a big industry, let's go here, 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 and here. Let's make new industries. We're going to have new, basically new industries and new models and new software and hardware that we can develop. And then all of a sudden, within a couple of years, they debuted their brand new Huawei Mate 60, one of the most advanced 5G phones, and all of it 100% made in China. And it absolutely was a huge, huge win. And interesting enough, it was the American Trade Secretary, I think Gina Raimondo. She actually arrived in Beijing. And it was perfect timing, and it was no doubt it was definitely done on purpose. But the Chinese government then released, or I should say Huawei then released that, and it was amazing because all of a sudden Gina Raimondo has just arrived in Beijing, the Trade Commerce Secretary from the United States, and boom, by the way, here's our brand new 5G phone, and it's basically a signal saying, look, we've overcome your sanctions, we've overcome this. Do not bet against us. We're going to be able to do that. And so, very long-winded answer. Apologies for me going on a little bit of a rant, but it is just very interesting to observe, how China has been able to progress, learn from this. And again, in my opinion, I think the trade sanctions have actually made China a lot stronger.
I remember the Intel sanctions. They were cutting off the supply of semiconductors because this was their main largest client. So, of course,
Yeah,
when you take out all this money out of Intel, that also means a lot of less money for research and development. And but meanwhile, the Chinese were able to develop self-sufficiency. And again, I wish that we would learn from this to avoid self-harm, because now it's not just denying tech, but as we saw with the Russians, we can take their national sovereign debt. Also with China, we can cut off access to banks, cut off access to shipping lanes,
right.
insurance systems. It's just an incentive system to decouple and develop more self-sufficiency. And I think also the US would undermine its central role in the international economy by doing so. I think part of the problem is often the assumption that this is that we're entering a new Cold War, and China is like the new Soviet Union. But I think this also builds into this misconception that China is extremely centralized, but its economy is very decentralized. So the competitiveness there among the different regions and industries, it's quite profound. But I guess a key competitiveness is also the supply chain, that the Chinese do, I guess, everything from the mining, processing to how do you see this being vital in the competitiveness between China and the United States? Well, ideally, it would become cooperation one day, but
Yeah, I mean, Glenn, I have two things I want to mention about this, which is really fascinating. In June of 2023, I flew to Shanghai to actually meet a Norwegian entrepreneur that lives he lives close to Wuxi. He has a factory there, and it's actually a textile factory. And this is actually a very interesting story because he has a joint venture with a local Chinese guy. They own the factory 50-50, but this Norwegian entrepreneur has been traveling to China. He's been in the textile industry for many, many years. And what is so fascinating is I purposely went there to record a video showcasing this factory to the world. It's one of my proudest videos that I've made on this YouTube channel because it gives such an interesting insight into the Chinese factories and how there's such a competitive advantage to manufacturing in China. What I discovered when I went to this small town near Wuxi is that not only is this the heartbeat of all of the textile industries, but for example, they have a factory that makes clothing. Okay. Well, every single piece of that entire textile industry is within a 20-mile radius. So, for example, if you're wanting to get buttons, there's the button factory, zippers, yarn, cotton, the dyes, to make the different colors, any of the stitching that you need done to put in the logos and things like this. Even the machines that are built to manufacture the textiles, those factories that make the machines are also in that area. So basically, every single piece of that entire economy that is needed for that supply chain exists in a very small area. And that is something unlike anything I've ever seen before. We typically in the United States, for example, you might have your factory in the state of Florida, for example. But you know what? I need to order zippers from here, and then buttons from there. I have to outsource for here. It's kind of spread out all over the place. And this is something that's very, very interesting. What I've observed in China is that they're very good at consolidating and making sure that all of these factories are in one location. And this is why, for example, for his factory, because he's in the textile industry, as you can imagine, every factory owner knows every factory owner, and they all work together. And again, if they need buttons or yarn, or I asked Tommy as his name, I said, "Oh, what if he wanted to manufacture hats?" Well, actually, there's the best hat manufacturers just down the road, so we know him. So we don't make hats; we just outsource to him, and we can do that. But that's a service that we offer. So it's this ecosystem that is just truly incredible, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen anywhere else in the world. That's the first point that I really wanted to bring up is that ecosystem that really drives innovation in China. And I forgot my second point that I wanted to make, but that was the first point, was just how advanced these industries are, and specifically with manufacturing.
Yeah. No, you see this, I think, in the tech industry as well. Again, forming this uh, hubs almost of where they also spin off each other's ideas. Because once there's a very monopolizing effect, it tends to stop the
Oh,
innovation. So,
actually,
there it
I
was.
just I just remembered my second point.
Yeah.
So you triggered that in my head here. So the other thing that's interesting is when we look at, for example, EVs, and we're going to go back to that example because this is very fascinating. The most intense rivalry within the EV industry is actually within the country of China. So it's actually, Beijing is competing against Shanghai, who's competing against Guangzhou, who's competing against Shenzhen. And what you see this very, very hungry and aggressive domestic economy inside of China that is very cutthroat. For example, there might be 100 new EV companies that are started in China. Well, the vast majority of them will fail because they're not able to survive because the competition amongst the domestic market in China is so intense that only the best are able to survive. So out of 100 EV companies that are started, 90 of them fail. But as a result, the 10 that do survive are battle tested. They're battle tested, and not only have they been able to survive this intense domestic competition, they have refined their technologies and they're so advanced that now it's actually very easy for them to go abroad. Because if you're able to survive in China, you can easily export and you can sell around the world. That's not going to be a problem for you. But again, this is how, why like a BYD has been so successful. They have risen to the top, and then along the way have had to really battle it out against all of the other EV companies. But now that they're at the top, very easy for them to go around the world and start exporting and saying, look, we're going to go to South America, where you see a tremendous amount of BYD locations and influence in the region. And it's because they already have a great product. They have defined that technology. So that's something that we also see that translates even to other industries. For example, like AI. AI, very intense rivalry domestically. And again, this is what spurs this innovation very, very much in China.
Well, Cyrus, thank you so much for your time. Just for anyone listening, how can people find you?
Yeah, so the easiest is just to follow my YouTube channel. So just type in Cyrus Janssen. You'll be able to find me. So follow me on YouTube, and then we also have a Substack newsletter as well. I know Glenn, you have a wonderful Substack, and I've been a big fan of your work. And I know I just want to say thank you for coming on my channel as well. I always enjoy our chats and learning from your perspective as well. So thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Great. Thanks again.
My pleasure.